Welcome everybody, and thank you so much for joining this really important panel called Beyond Prevention Puppets and How to Meaningfully Engage Men and Boys in Preventing Violence Against Women and Girls. My name is Emma Fulu and I'm the founder and executive director of the Equality Institute. And I've been working in the space of men, masculinities and violence against women for nearly 2 decades. So it's my absolute honor to be moderating this session today. Before I start, I just wanted to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land where I'm sitting today, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and any other Aboriginal people in the room today. And I do the same for the lands where you're joining from today. I know many of us are joining from all over the world, not just Australia. And we I know have so much to learn from Aboriginal cultures around the world, many of which are the longest living cultures in history. So about today's session, individual men are often placed at the front of prevention campaigns, and sometimes that can seem like it's very tokenistic and kind of a gesture that rarely sees any real engagement of those men in the on-the-ground work. Sometimes those men are referred to as prevention puppets. So they come, they're seen, but they're rarely considered as valuable contributors to the prevention of violence against women and girls. And we want to acknowledge also that men are gendered beings, just like women, and gendered factors drive violence against women. So we want to think about how do we actually move beyond this sort of tokenistic sort of discussion of male engagement and meaningfully think about what it means to have men and boys engaged in the prevention of violence against women. Today, we really want to think about how to move beyond the comfortable conversations perhaps that we've been having in this space. We know that it's a tense area in some ways. There's conflict and there's tensions around how people see this work. But we want to engage with that complexity. We want to understand the complexity of men's lives and women's lives and explore the hierarchical systems that we all live in. The systems of power and oppressions that are imposed on both men and women and people of all genders. So today we're really privileged to be joined by some of the world's leading voices on masculinities. And in particular, we're really honoured to hear about the different perspectives of Indigenous men and men of colour and how their unique experiences and identities drive their activism and scholarship in preventing violence against women. So let me introduce the panellists. We've got Desmond Campbell joining us. So Desmond is one of the Guruji and Naglakan people of Australia. So he's based in Darwin in the Northern Territory of Australia and is the first person's practice lead with Social Ventures Australia Consulting. He's also previously worked for the Northern Territory government in a number of roles, including operations manager for the community-based family prevention program with Northern Territory Correctional Services. And Desmond has extensive experience in family and domestic violence prevention and is currently a board member of VAWG, which is a lead prevention organisation in Australia. Next, we have Kam Chantabisuk, who is currently the program specialist at the Ending Violence Against Women section of UN Women. He's also a member of the Regional Learning Community for Transforming Patriarchal Masculinities to Promote Gender Justice in East and Southeast Asia. And Kam has been working in the field of ending violence against women and promoting gender justice for about 12 years. And thirdly, we have Baimi Williamson. And Baimi is a Yuhulehi man from Northwest New South Wales and Southwest Queensland with family ties to Northwest Queensland. He holds a master's degree of arts in Indigenous government from the University of Victoria in British Columbia and a continuing education certificate in Indigenous governance from the University of Arizona. His fields of expertise include Indigenous land and water management, Indigenous youth, Indigenous governments, and Indigenous data sovereignty, and is currently doing his PhD on Indigenous men and masculinities. So welcome everybody. I wanted to start with you, Des. I hope we can have this as a pretty casual conversation and people feel free to jump in when you want to add something. And I'd also encourage members of the audience to please add questions in the chat function and we'll definitely get to those. But if I could start with you, Des, the title of this panel is about prevention puppets. And so we wanted to ask you, individual men, as we said, are sometimes placed at the front of prevention campaigns in a tokenistic gesture. But do you see them? Do you think they're puppets or change agents or both?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Emma, and good morning to everyone. Let me know if you can hear me okay and there's no issues there. Just give me a shout out. But thank you very much for having me on this morning. I think it's a very important conversation, and I think it's brilliant that we as men can be a part of this, and men of colour and particularly Aboriginal men having this conversation within Australia. This term of prevention puppets is, it's something that I started to use a few years ago after going through a journey of going through a personal experience of being around and constantly sort of surrounded in my community by domestic and family violence, and experiencing that on a personal level, but then working in this environment and being noticed by, I guess, non-Indigenous people working in this sector, and being picked up by them to be the face of preventing violence, but not having the autonomy to be able to lead that on my own, and being, I guess, equipped with these tools that were, it's like I was handed all these sort of information and tools to be able to do this prevention work, but I had no say in the matter and how it was done, even though I came from the community and had a personal experience and awareness of how domestic and family violence was occurring, and how my own community was also preventing it. And this term prevention puppets really sort of came to me in a way that's how I felt. I didn't feel like I was able to bring my own sort of experience and my own solutions to it. And, often we see this in the social sector, especially within the Aboriginal community, or perhaps I can only speak to that. As Aboriginal people, whether it's not-for-profits or non-government organisations that do great work in the space of working with Aboriginal people and Aboriginal communities, quite often there's been historically a discrimination against Aboriginal people being a part of the solution. So I compare it to that in a way. If you're wanting to engage with men, and particularly in the circumstances that I work in a lot, Aboriginal men, we should be involving Aboriginal men. And I hear that and certainly agree, there's concerns of collusion, including that often we're worried about, and we certainly need to be vigilant of that. But we need to find ways to effectively involve men in being able to have the autonomy and leadership in this space, because I certainly in my community, there's groups and pockets of Aboriginal men and Torres Strait Islander men that are leaders in the community, and often coming together that want to form and want to lead prevention of violence against women and children in our community.
Thanks, Des. Yeah, that's some really important insights. Carm, did you want to jump in and talk a little bit about how you've seen that, and whether you think, prevention, the way that we see male engagement at the moment in your work, and why you think that kind of notion of the puppet and a not real genuine engagement and genuine leadership has been harmful or ineffective, or where you've even seen it work well.
Yeah. Thank you, Emma, for the invitation to this conversation. I cannot agree more with this one. Actually, that's the point that I wanted to highlight in response to your question as well, because I don't think men are puppets, but the way we work with men, the way we approach men, are using men as puppets. Men are definitely change agents, and men can move the mountains if men want to, in terms of ending violence and promoting equality. But the way men are instrumentalized in the work on preventing violence, it's as if men, like what Desmond said, men are puppets, or men are being used for that. And similar to my experience as well, Desmond, in a few developing countries that I have been working with, the tools, the approach, and the methodologies in the social sectors came from somewhere. It's developed from either global north, by academic institutions, by researchers, by international practitioners. Of course, they all do some adaptation. They claim that this is adapting to the local context, contextualizations of the tools and materials. But at the end, these tools do not reflect or understand the complexity of men's life in reality in their own communities. And without understanding men's life and their social, political, and economic context, and demanding them or asking them or motivate them to do something, it's like what you say. It's losing of autonomy in contributing to the work. So basically, we are feeding the words into men's mouths so men can say the right things, but not necessarily coming from what they want to do. We did not manage to understand their life, their experience of discriminations and oppressions, and what can men gain from engaging in this work? What can men gain in losing male privilege and male power? These hard and difficult questions are not discussed with men before working with them. So the approach is simplified and artificial and then very superficial, and this is why we don't have so many good evidence that working with individual men produce good results. Thank you, Emma.
Thanks, Kham. No, that's really interesting, and I'm going to bring in Baimi here to add to the conversation. It might be. I know there's going to be some questions, and I'm going to just play devil's advocate for a second around, because one of the criticisms I think from the other side is around from the feminist women's movement might be that male sort of men's engagement and the kind of, I guess, that it's become, cool and the thing that gets funded, and is that taking away from sort of women's-led work and the organizations and movements that have driven, this work for decades. So I just wanted to put that on the table and see if anyone wanted to respond. I know that's not sort of what we're saying, but I think it's important to acknowledge what does it mean to do this work. Perhaps Baimi, you can add before I ask you a bit more about masculinities, but what does it mean for men to be engaged in this work in a way, particularly men of colour and Aboriginal men, in a way that is leading, but also in collaboration, obviously, with women who have been doing this work as well.
Yeah, thanks, Emma. And thank you so much for, bringing me in on such an easy question to answer. And I'll do my best. But no, it is actually a really important point, but I think it's really important that we kind of, there's a very important component of this work of, prevention of violence against women and girls, or domestic and family violence, where it's essential to engage men. And I think a lot of the evidence kind of points to men's programs designed by men for men can be quite valuable and can be effective. And I just say, that the cost of funding these programs or research into preventing violence like aimed at men should not be at the expense of programs to support women and families. They should be complementary to that, really. So, I think together, advocates, especially feminists, Indigenous feminists, and Indigenous men in this space should be, I'd like to think of it as both advocating for the same thing and advocating for greater resources, because as we know, anyone in the community sector dealing with this stuff in Australia or anywhere else is, resources are very tight, and we need more of these very serious, deeply embedded issues, and they require, serious engagement, starting with some adequate resourcing.
Absolutely. I know your sort of areas of expertise is around masculinity, and here comes my daughter. But we know that from the evidence, obviously, gender equality is, a driver of violence against women, but also, different models of masculinity we know are contributing in different ways that could be both positive and negative. And I wanted to ask you, Baimi, what is shapes constructions of masculinities for Indigenous men that in terms of what your work has found?
Yeah, sure. So this is kind of the key question, right? Who gets to define and I guess put a value on certain types of masculinities, certain types of male identities. The short answer is it's a settler colonial system that awards and rewards those masculine identities, but there are multiple issues with that. Beginning with this understanding that settler colonial notions of masculinity come from a certain place, they come from a certain time, and what that creates is a very shallow, very narrow definition of masculinity, and that very shallow, very narrow definition is imparted onto men of from diverse backgrounds, from different ethnic backgrounds, different cultural backgrounds, all around the world, or what we might now call the new world, and we see that's had almost catastrophic impacts on communities in these lands. So, and not just on men in communities of colour and of diverse cultural backgrounds, but also non-Indigenous, European people from European origins. If you look at the rates of domestic and family violence in mainstream communities, it's incredible. It's incredibly high, and we know it's severely underreported as well. So this idea of masculinity coming from that place is really detrimental, not just to Indigenous people or people from other cultural and ethnic backgrounds, but also on people of European ancestry and origin as well. It's a pretty it paints a pretty damning picture. So, but I think thankfully we're kind of coming into a time where people are really trying to talk about that openly, trying to find ways to confront it and challenge the discourse and challenge the narrative, much as this panel evidences that, and which is why it's so important and so exciting to be a part of. In terms of the work that I do, it's very much trying to not reconstruct, but engage with Indigenous notions of men and masculinity and manhood, Indigenous notions of gender relations, and by having that culturally grounded, place-based understanding of who men were, what they did, what were their roles and responsibilities, we can then look at how colonisation has impacted and disrupted those identities, and look at the emergent identities that have come out since then, and really kind of get to this place of understanding not just who Indigenous men are, or who they think they are, but why they think they're like that as well. And I think that's these are really important questions and really deep questions. And whilst they're not they might not be funded through a violence prevention program. I think the long-term impact of having these conversations and developing a better understanding will be much more diverse masculine identities, much more enriched field, and a much more culturally grounded understanding. We know that people who are connected with culture are less likely to perpetrate violence. So really important.
That's so important, isn't it? Carm or Des, did you want to jump in? I mean, thinking about how you see different models of masculinity being constructed and played out in your own communities, Southeast Asia, for example, Carm.
Yeah, I'm glad we are talking about masculinity in a broader context rather than the work with men and boys, because the constructions of masculinity or masculine narratives takes the whole society to do that, right? And masculinity is in relation with femininity. It doesn't exist on its own. So the work with men and boys and also with women and girls is around constructing the new narrative of masculinity and femininity and how they complement each other in a way that the power is being shared. So this is why, going back to the first question, Emma, about working with men and boys, I think sometimes the approach fail to consider that the work with men and boys itself is not sufficient, because individual men and boys do not create this narrative of masculinity as a whole. We are soldiers for walking this manhood and social norms, but it takes the whole society to enforce and to create it. I remember a few workshops we had in Cambodia and in Vietnam, and men came to us and saying that I am a very equitable boys and men, but when I go home, my wives and my moms do not like the way equitable I am. They don't want me to cook. They don't want me to clean. So it is not about working with men and boys, but it is about working with community and institutions of changing the narrative of masculinity and femininity. So I'm glad we are talking about that.
Thanks, Carm. Yeah, no, I think that's really important, isn't it? I mean, patriarchy is not created by individual people or one gender alone. It is created by, the whole of society. And similarly, the way we think about masculinities in different contexts is construction by men, women, community, society, media, institutions, government, capitalism. So it's not going to be sort of recreated in positive and community driven ways by individual men alone. Des, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, thank you, Emma. And such great points by my colleagues on the panel. I guess something that I was reflecting on during that discussion was this work that I quite often used to do a lot with mostly Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander prisoners in the space of prevention of violence against women and children. And often we would go through this amazing program that would be, this sort of, I guess it's sort of set up as a psychological education type program where there's that peer support that's and the context of the program, is evidence-based research that has developed it, but then it's gone through a process of being culturally appropriate as well. And it was great seeing this men go through this program and support each other and see that at that individual level, them becoming aware of their masculinity and the impacts of that in their family unit and their community. But as Carm mentioned, these men would then go back into their community and back into their family units and find it really difficult, not only them, but their family would find it really difficult to try and understand what was going on and why you've changed and it was so obvious that there's such a need to bring not only partners but families and community along this journey of learning about masculinity, feminism, and how they coexist in order to ensure this prevention of violence against women and children.
Yeah, absolutely. It's so interesting, isn't it? I think part of what we're talking about, is that, there's obviously well-established evidence that violence against women is driven by gender inequality, but we also know that that intersects with other forms of inequality and oppression. And intersectionality, I think, has become a bit of a buzzword, but I wonder, to try and unpack that a bit more, what that looks like in practice. What sort of other sort of forms of oppression or discrimination do you see men in your communities facing that intersect with gender inequality, and what does that mean for engaging men in this gender justice work? I don't know if anyone wanted to jump in around that by me.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in, and I think this is such an important question, and it's so in the work that I do, it's kind of bringing together the limited data that we have on violent male perpetrators, especially more violent Aboriginal male perpetrators, and of the limited data that we have on the profile of male perpetrators of violence against women and children, it's pretty clear that the large majority of these men were abused as children. And I think this is really such just like an important part, a critical piece of understanding prevention, is to understand that violence against women and children is a cyclical process. So we have people who were abused as children perpetrating abuse against children. But what we also know is that these men, many of whom end up in the criminal justice system, although some do not, don't have adequate programs that allow them to talk about their experiences, to address those experiences, to get the effective treatment, the therapeutic treatment that they need. So we know that we understand very clearly that this cyclical process exists. We know abuse against children is has a strong correlation to people who perpetuate violence, and yet we still don't design the programs. We still don't have the programs that engage with, in particular, boys. As I said, to talk about their experiences, to overcome their experiences, well, not even overcome, but to understand what's happened to them and be able to make sense of that. So we don't have those programs generally, and we also it becomes kind of exacerbated even more for Indigenous boys and Indigenous men, because we don't have in Australia anyway, we have not even a culturally informed psychotherapy field. We don't have culturally grounded, by and large, we don't have culturally grounded mental health services. We don't have enough Indigenous psychologists, and so it's kind of exposing multiple absences. And these multiple absences I would say is allowing this process to continue, and allowing the violence continuum to continue. And these are the kind of things that we really need to understand, because it will require an intergenerational response and intervention, and we need to understand what's going on, get better data, and put things in place such as the training and scholarships for Aboriginal people to go into psychology, into mental health services. And people really designing the field and creating this new field that adequately responds to experiences, adequately accounts for colonisation, and it's grounded in Indigenous worldviews. So,
wow, that's such an important point, and it just really highlights, I think, the fact how this work, or the so-called field of engaging men and boys, needs to be broadened so significantly, because it isn't about this sort of individualized program. What you're talking about is, you know, structural, systemic, institutional change. And that, but the positive I hear from that is that's a solution. I mean, what you're putting on the table is actually, you know, a genuine, meaningful, I can imagine quite transformative solution that we could, you know, collectively contribute to. I think it's really powerful. Does Des or Khan, did you want to add anything about how you see those sort of different forms of oppression playing out in your own communities?
Yeah, so one of the most difficult things or challenges to talk to men on gender equality in Laos and different places in Southeast Asia is to talk about this issue with poor men or marginalized men. So that has always been a struggle for prevention intervention, because how do we go to a village in a mountain where there's no food, where there's no access to basic needs, and demand them to be gender equitable based on our ideas, by the way, how we define that gender equality. So it's very difficult when economic justice, where certain men and certain groups of women are left behind for economic growth or economic development, who do not have access to basic care, basic education, and basic needs, who do not have livelihood security. And how do we engage in conversations on these ideal gender equality norms when men's and women's life are struggling to put their food on the table every day? So, you know, this system of the hierarchies in the societies, and who are the men on the top, who are the men on the bottom. So the difficulty is to speak with the men who are at the lower level of this economic pyramid. But interestingly, in the work with men and boys is normally created by social development groups or by interventions, and most of the time intervention goes to these groups. This is why sometimes we feel so uncomfortable about this intervention, because we use men or women as a lab. It's as a training lab or experiment lab, that I'm going to go there, work with this group for 2 months and see if they change their gender attitudes and behavior. But that it's sometimes I feel it's very unethical, because it's seated away from men's and women's reality. It's as if we want to give them some tool and then demanding them to change without changing the environment and conditions around them. Because gender equality, to be frank, it's not the top priority when there's no food on the table. When, for example, in the US, when you are going out as a Black man and being afraid of being shot by police or being harassed by other groups of people. So that is not men's and women's reality. So we need to find ways to discuss and situate the work with men and boys, or the reframing on masculinity, in a broader context of different system of oppressions and inequalities.
Absolutely. Thanks, Carm. Did you want to add anything, Des? I mean, COVID obviously has sort of exacerbated that in some ways, this idea, these underlying economic inequalities and how they relate to gender inequalities playing out together. Are you seeing any of that in your work or communities?
Before I go into that, Emma, I just wanted to sort of quickly concentrate on an angle that Bami touched on, which was, you know, this collection of data and evidence that create, you know, these resources, but also in turn then government program guidelines follow these resources and structure their, you know, reporting mechanisms around these resources developed on this evidence that's collected. Often or not, and you know, as you mentioned in the introduction, I'm a board member of VAWG, which do really great work in collecting evidence and developing resources and prevention of violence against women. As an Aboriginal person living in the Northern Territory and growing up in Katherine and other communities, and not only did I experience and see this violence that was happening amongst families and community, I also saw great pockets of prevention work that's been done by these communities and these families. How is that being collected? We need to really look at the way that we're collecting data and best practice, and really challenge ourselves. If that doesn't fit in this sort of on that national level of a violence prevention program, then we really need to look at ourselves in sort of changing the way that we collect that evidence, because it might be very micro level in this sort of prevention stuff that's happening in the communities, but it's happening and it's working, and they need to be funded, and we need those opportunities to be innovative, to be able to fund these micro level community prevention programs, or they don't even think of them as programs, they're just the way of doing things, and really study that and invest into that. And I guess going on to your other point around I think it was COVID and how that's being economically affected in funding. Was it in violence prevention being funded during COVID?
Yeah, and also I guess what Carm's talking about around economic injustice overall, and how do we, when communities are really just sort of struggling to, like you said, make ends meet, get food on the table, and perhaps sort of gender inequality in the way that we talk about it as like this programmatic thing feels so far removed from the realities of their everyday, and really is that a priority? I guess it's really interesting to think about how that's playing out, particularly in a COVID context.
Yeah, really good point, Carm. As you was talking about that, I was thinking about how often I need to go between these worlds of working in the space of prevention and using this language and having these types of discussions, and then it's almost that, like, as soon as I leave the office and hop in my car and go home, it's just such a different world, and it's trying to adjust those worlds to be able to work, to acknowledge each other and their realization of the world that unfortunately is still playing out in terms of the level of violence that's happening against women and children. We all, I'm sure everyone, even the audience on this forum will know that the level of violence that was happening during COVID and still is happening was through the roof. And we just weren't ready, and we weren't equipped to be able to address that in a way that we needed to. And, if anything, I hope this is something that we've learned to be able to, if for instance, if there's more lockdowns here in Australia or across the world, we now learn how we can sort of provide the support that we need to families that are in houses where it's unsafe. In terms of, as I mentioned, in communities where these pockets of prevention work is happening, this is something that we need to, sort of maybe a solution in addressing this, the need of support. Funding these programs that are happening in the communities, funding these practices that happen in communities, so the community themselves have the autonomy to be able to handle it, even through pandemics or through situations where government funding has been redirected into other areas.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting idea, that sort of building that long-term systems and resilience, that when we have these crises, that communities themselves sort of have the capacity and the support and resources they need to be able to drive the work that they know is working on the ground. I've got a question from the audience, actually a couple. One, everyone's saying amazing panel, so thanks everybody. One question is about, I'm just going to read it. What does the panel think about accountability for men who use violence? Given that Indigenous males in the Northern Territory are the most incarcerated people in the entire world, do settler, colonial or Western forms of accountability simply contribute to mass incarceration of Indigenous people? Is it possible to have forms of accountability outside the criminal justice system? And what do they look like? What the challenges might be? Just an easy little question. Anyone want to answer that one by me?
Yeah, I'm happy to go, Emma, because this is actually...
Oh, you're on mute.
There we are.
Thanks.
Yeah, this is a really important question. And looking at the question and really understanding it, I think it draws in a lot of components of what we've been talking about on this panel. So when we talk about accountability, so a big part of the work that I do, as I said, is kind of stitching together this kind of pre-colonial male roles and responsibilities and masculine identities. And a central part of being able to do that requires putting back together and getting a holistic picture of how Aboriginal societies function, how Aboriginal societies lived, daily, and daily habits, daily living arrangements, daily tasks and those kinds of things, the more mundane things that we kind of take for granted as we go about our lives. One of the key parts, one of the really, really central components of that daily life was communal accountability and communal policing of people's activities. And when you think about it, like Indigenous societies in Australia, and I'm sure many Indigenous societies internationally as well, we didn't have the domesticated domicile, like we didn't have the 3-bedroom, 1-bathroom house, right? We lived openly. We lived in camps of people. We lived we lived in a community of people, multiple families living together. And so what you had in that system, I guess, was this ability to communally police people's behaviour. And so it's kind of like this fabrication or this invention of the public and the private personas that people have did not exist in the way that we understand them now. The public was the private, so if you were to sort of get angry at your partner and lash out at your partner, it was in the open, people could see it, and it was policed and people were pulled up on it. And it was addressed kind of generally then and there. And then if behaviour like that escalated, there were other forms that kind of dealt with that. But it's like that communal policing and people communally owning, like violence, I guess, and keeping violence in check is something that was almost obliterated in colonisation when you had people being moved into houses. So what you had was this kind of really effective way of policing violence against women, and you had that completely removed, and people were put into domiciles, people were put into housing, and you had, for the first time in Indigenous societies, you had this creation of a private space that allows violence to be perpetrated. And so it's not saying we need to go back to living communally, but what we can say is understand that there were systems in place that were very effective at policing that behaviour, and that goes almost diametrically against how domestic violence has been treated in Euro-American settler colonial societies, where like a man's home is his castle, it's private business, it's their business, we don't get involved in their business and that kind of thing. Like that's kind of allowing a whole environment, a whole ecosystem of violence to be perpetrated at the family level. Whereas Indigenous societies had ways of negating that. So that's kind of understanding how violence has been allowed and what systems in settler colonialism have allowed, this violence, this very specific type of violence to emerge and to become really entrenched is really important. And perhaps the values of communally owning of relationships, not being between a man and a woman, but being part of a whole system, a whole community of people, is a really important way of addressing these issues. And and the only other comment I'd make that was in the question was around the role of prisons. It gets to the question of what are prisons for? Are they punitive or are they restorative? That question, the response to that question will determine exactly, who belongs in prison, how long they should be there, and how it's used. So, it'd be fantastic for people who perpetrate violence, especially first-time offenders or young offenders, to be targeted in restorative programs and maybe not go to prison, but to get out to sort of culture with really strong, healthy communities of people, men and women. But it's not to say there isn't a role for prison, just to say maybe it's not, it definitely can't be what we currently have.
The one and only role, yeah. It's so interesting, Bami, because my PhD research in a totally different context in the Maldives, where my family is from, I found exactly the same thing, that we historically did not have a clear distinction between public and private space, and we had very low rates of violence, and rates of violence were increasing. And one of the reasons I found that they were increasing is because was the increase in this, or the introduction of this idea of the private space, and the seclusion of people. And so totally different part of the world, but really similar idea around and how that impacts on violence. So really fascinating. Anyone want to add into that? Otherwise, there is another question from the audience, which Des?
Perhaps I'll just, being from the Northern Territory, I'd like to sort of weigh in on that.
Absolutely.
And such a great, thanks, Shay. It's really important to highlight that Indigenous males in Northern Territory are the most incarcerated people in the entire world. On the flip side of that, the levels of violence against women in the Northern Territory are also, are very high. These are the 85 to 90% of the prison population in the Northern Territory, Aboriginal people, with female Aboriginals prisoner population rising every year at a rate that is, very concerning. That's the reality of it. That's the reality of these programs that we have in place currently that are being funded. That's the reality of their outcome reach. We need something that needs to work. And, Bami may have touched on it a bit earlier. The programs in this men's prevention space, they're just not working. Programs around, working with young men, young boys, are not being funded enough to be able to have that reach. Of those men that are in prison, there's a high percentage, and it's been a few years since I've worked couple of years since I worked directly in the prison under the family violence program, but it's something like 60 to 70% of those Indigenous males within prison have, experienced or played some part of violence against women and children or other men. So, that we really need to look at the way that we're approaching this, because it's obviously not working. And this accountability, by me, I know in some of the work that I do up here still in the Northern Territory, I'm often coming across communities where they tell me about how particular elders in the community are directed to, have that sort of leadership to be able to work with families when there's, conflict happening within the family. And so how do we acknowledge that? And, I guess it was touching on what I said earlier about these pockets of prevention stuff that's happening in community. How do we acknowledge it? How do we record it? How do we support it? And these concepts of colonial Western forms of accountability are often it separates our community. Women and community in general don't trust this form of accountability. They don't trust this form of authority. And, you know, it might often create more harm than good, because women may not want to see their men be taken to prison, or they don't trust the police to take them away. You know, there's been experiences of really, you know, intense sort of injustices against our communities that create a non-trust to police and authority and the courts. So women might often, you know, they don't have any, if they don't have these elders to go to, they don't trust the police, then they must be putting up with this violence. And we need to be able to put in measures to allow the community to, I guess, address these solutions. It doesn't mean dismantle police. It doesn't mean they don't have a place in the society, but there needs to be something local to work with these communities.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Des. Carm, I wonder if, just while we're on it, if you've seen anything else in, you know, Southeast Asia or beyond around restorative justice, as opposed to criminal justice, in this work that you've seen good examples of, or even just sort of a similar demand for that type of approach?
Yeah, the issues are very similar, Emma. When we're talking about mass incarceration of certain groups, also this is linked with other form of inequality and oppressions. For example, in my country, we don't have race. We are the same race, but we have different ethnicities. So, you know, the sentencings, it's heavier towards certain groups of population compared to another group. For example, the ethnic majority slapping a wife maybe $100 fine, but for an ethnic minority man, it would be 2 years of imprisonment. So we also see the linkages between racism and xenophobia and classism intervening with the criminal justice system. And of course, when these men come out, and because traditionally in our country, in Laos and also many places in Southeast Asia, divorce is not common. So being imprisoned for a long time, they return back to their families and to their wives. And then there's the stigma and prejudice against former inmates, and they cannot have jobs, they cannot have access to basic needs. It creates family conflicts. The violent circle starts over again. So again, the work on violence prevention has to be linked with other form of justice of men's and women's life. We do, at the community level, we do have the community justice system. But again, that's also depending on the social class or situation of that family in that community. The informal system would refer the poor and the marginalized family or men to the criminal, the formal system, but then those with money, with social status, can be resolved within the community. So it's not, for us, it's not working well, the formal one and the informal one. And also because we are governed by patriarchal norm. So the informal one or the community justice system also maintain community harmony. That would mean silencing women and then accepting certain violence norm in the families. These are the norms that we still have to work to change with communities member. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So community justice doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be perfect if in some ways it's stemming still from a patriarchal system, but that it does offer some alternative options. I guess it's an interesting thought. We have a question from Luxman, or a comment question. I'll read it. so again, fascinating panel. The way currently the development sector is considering and creating the work with men and boys as something like a silver bullet driven by those who are from the global north and the ideals of gender equality and equal societies. So those that we can see, those that we see or consider as evidence on this work are from those organisations driven by the Eurocentric narratives and approaches when it comes to defining how part of the work, mostly driven by the perceptions of donor countries and how the work should be done. So is then those who are doing this work in the recipient end becoming puppets? And how can we strengthen the grounded or global South leadership in this work? How can we decolonize this work in general so that we don't get into the same trap that the international development sector in general is in? Big question. Anyone want to have a crack? How do we strengthen the global grounded work, I guess? Work that's grounded in community, work that's grounded in global South leadership. How do we decolonize this work, I guess, is the big question. And you've already pointed, I think, to some great examples, but anything to add by me?
Yeah, and it just this is a great question, and I see this definitely coming up in another part of the work that I do, and that is in environmental land management and conservation, where you see international conservation NGOs coming into areas, where into Indigenous people's lands, and sort of by coming in with the very rigid notions of conservation and land management, and that's, I understand that as completely a colonial process, but just being done under a green umbrella, and the same could be said, I say, in the way that I understand it, the same can be understood in this space, in sort of decolonising gendered relations and really trying to promote, to prevent violence against women and girls, and also to promote, the participation of women in particular in society. So I think that I think the first thing that needs to be understood is, especially working with Indigenous communities, both here in Australia and internationally, is that, Indigenous communities are so vast, they're so culturally diverse. And even here in Australia, on mainland Australia, like we get, we get sucked into talking about like Indigenous people or Aboriginal people. But the cultural and linguistic diversity of Aboriginal people on mainland Australia is enormous. Desmond's been talking to his experiences up in the NT, where I'm from in Western New South Wales. It'd be very, very different again. So really engaging with these kind of place-based communities, place-based identities is actually really important. And not being part of that colonial machinery, really, it forces people to examine not just the subjects but themselves equally, and their viewpoints, their standpoint, where they come from, why their ideas are the way that are formed the way that they are. So it's kind of like deconstructing oneself before going in and working with communities, because otherwise we just kind of, we do get, there is the danger of getting drawn into the saviour mentality, and that's the same mentality that brought kind of missionaries to Indigenous communities, with the hope of saving them. And I think that anyone, I guess, from this field, working in particular with Indigenous communities, I think the first thing they need to be aware of is the fact that they might just be really offended by the way that some communities organise and the gender relations that exist in certain communities. And even the idea of equality, like in the research that I do and the conversations that I have, like equality is a word very rarely used when describing the role of men and women in community. It's not about equality, it's about, the key word that I hear time and time again is balance between men and women. And so, we kind of get to this place of understanding that the majority of living in Aboriginal communities, both today and historically, is shared. It's not really separated along gender lines, and people kind of perform the same things and look after kids and organise food and generally promote their positive health and well-being and communal belonging of everyone. Everyone participates in that, regardless of their gender, regardless of their sexuality, which is something we haven't touched on. But then there are very gendered spaces, and some of them spaces are very rigid, and some of them spaces are likely to offend people who come from a purely kind of Western feminist viewpoint, standpoint. But the idea isn't I guess the way that I understand it is that it's not like offensive, or it's not necessarily a bad thing to have gendered spaces. The danger only comes in when those gendered spaces start to be attributed, when value starts to be attributed to that. So is one valued more than the other? Well, then this is where Eurocentric gendered roles really co-opted. It's like the roles and functions that men perform are valued much higher economically, and women's women's work by and large is unpaid mostly, whereas like an Indigenous standpoint would say that, well, yes, men and women do different things, but the weight of them is equal, and the community requires the both of them operating in unison, balancing off one another, and one is not more valuable than the other. They just serve different purposes in community, and community needs both of them operating effectively, efficiently, and respectfully to promote this holistic sense of community. So, yeah, it's not saying that men and women need to do everything equally, and everything needs to be kind of 50-50, but it's saying that no matter what we do, like we all have a role to play, and we're all equally valued.
Absolutely, yeah. So interesting. It's making me. This is kind of like questioning the big fundamentals in a way of a lot of the work we do, and the way that you're talking. When I hear this so much importance about the real local, like really local. And we don't just mean national or even state-based, we mean, like the sort of at the micro level. And then that really calls into question, I think, the way that we often talk about this work in terms of like global best practice, or, like it almost the totally contradictory in a way. We're not going to be able to, when we're seeing solutions working on the ground that are at sort of this micro level, then that has to really make us question these ideas, these sort of bigger development ideas that we're bringing in, that there is this notion of global best practice, or there's this idea that like this is working and we should adopt that. And I think it's really important for us to disrupt that way of thinking, because it is, like you said, that's kind of coming from a colonial machinery, that idea of, like colonizing everything to be the same. And clearly that hasn't worked. Anyway, it's making me, it's really fascinating. So I appreciate that. Des, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, Emma, thank you. Laxman, great statement and question. I wanted to jump in and say, I just find it fascinating that Australia is internationally known for its work in developing resources around prevention of violence against women and children. However, we have such a, COVID is not the only pandemic that's happening here in Australia. We have such high levels of violence still here in Australia against women and children, particularly in the Indigenous communities. With the organisation such as NROS and VAWG, they do great work in this space, and they there's an inclusion of at different levels of how we collect evidence and then develop resources. But why aren't there organisations out there that are purely Indigenous led? With leaders from, Indigenous researchers such as VAWG, led by, people that have experienced directly this in their communities, violence that is happening in their families and communities. I remember when I first started working in this space, often I was the only Indigenous person sitting around a table, you know, of very important people and decision makers at that sort of Northern Territory government level, at that state level, of making decisions around frameworks that will in turn then decide how programs will be developed and delivered to majority of Aboriginal people. But I was the only Aboriginal person that was at that table. And I, even though I was at that table, didn't feel I had a strong voice in ensuring that, you know, these frameworks that we were developing was reflecting what we needed in the community. And, you know, that's where Laxman makes such a great point. And, you know, these end beneficiaries of these programs that we are developing, are they just becoming puppets of what we are, you know, I guess, teaching? And exactly that. You're a product of your environment. You're a product of what you're learning. You're a product of what you're exposed to. And this is, you know, I keep sort of banging on about it. This is why it's so important to allow communities to be able to make mistakes, but also then develop things that work in their own communities. We need to really concentrate and invest in this micro level of being able to find solutions, not this blanket approach of being able to, you know, I guess, blanket approach of doing program delivery and then recording that, because it's obviously not working here in Australia. It might look like it is, we're great in the space, but we still have high levels of domestic and family violence, especially in the Aboriginal community.
Yeah, absolutely. Carm, what do you think in terms of how we sort of reshape this work to be, you know, grounded in community, being led by the Global South and the communities where the work's happening? How do we decolonise this work? I know it's sort of like, again, it's this huge question, but I think these practical examples that you're sharing of what it looks like on the ground is really helpful.
Well, thank you, Laxman, for that difficult question. I don't know, really. It's been a question. I don't know, Emma, if you remember, this was the question we asked at P4P, Partner for Preventions, in terms of decolonizing knowledge, how knowledge on violence prevention was generated in Southeast Asia. It's hard because we are still, Australia is a different context because Australia is a rich country. But many countries in East and Southeast Asia, mostly Southeast Asia, we are still living in the shadow of colonial system, and our current global economic order, it is a colonial systems. So international development work and social development work rely heavily on donors. So it's a struggle, right? In Australia, at least, you have local resources. You have resources from your own government. In my country, you know, it's funded by donors. So it's donor who dictate the agenda. It's donor who decide what they want to do and what the result would look like and what tools and materials we have to use. And this is happening in many places in Southeast Asia because we rely on donors for funding community work. Also, the questionings around governance, you know, the democratic processes of our countries, if there are civic space or civil society spaces for community movements, then things can happen. But if we are living under a more, how to say it diplomatically correct, a stricter governance systems, it's harder to build a community movement because communities are controlled by governments and by states. So we are caught up between state control in everything and also the mercy of donors in terms of doing social work. Donors have their own agenda very colonial in many senses. Our own governments also have their own agendas, and it's very difficult, Lakshman, I must say. I don't have answer for that, but I do truly believe the work we did before in P4P, it's in terms of democratizing knowledge at the community level. How do we work with activists and practitioners, especially young people nowadays who have access to resources and to knowledge? How do we work with them to plant seeds of critical thinking, of how to engage in meaningful conversations for the well-being of our own community? We don't need donors to come and tell us, you need to prevent violence, you need to solve climate change issue, you need to build latrine. There needs to be a communication from our own community. Why do we need latrine? Why do we need clean water? Why do we need to protect environment? Why do we need to respect women? That type of conversation, that type of knowledge have to come among us for sustainable reasons. Because again, relying on donors change priorities all the time. My country used to rely on AUSAID, the former Australian funding mechanism, a lot on gender work. And suddenly Australia shifted the priorities and we have less gender work in Laos. And suddenly another new donors come, so it's not sustainable. So to decolonize the process, we need to work with local. It would be ideal to have more time, resources, and commitment and effort in working with local communities, activists, and mobilizers to start the process on the ground.
Absolutely, thank you so much, Kham. Yeah, I think that we've been having similar discussions. I know myself, along with many others in the feminist movement, in different spaces, because, like you said, donor priorities change, and organisations or donors or funders, even private philanthropy that we thought we could rely on, can change at the drop of a hat. And trying to think about what are sustainable ways that we can, because our movements should not be dependent on these external, ideally, ideas of what we should be doing, and we want to be able to drive the change that we from our own communities. And I think that's so important. We're getting close to time. I'm going to Des.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, no, jump in, Des. Then I'll ask my final question.
Just very quickly, I wanted to, there's this, make a point about this reliant on, I guess, government to provide those solutions. Something that's happening in the Northern Territory is this process of allowing those decision-making to be put back onto the community. This is something that's been led by the Northern Territory government. Now, if this is done properly and sort of local decision-making is truly handed back to community, I see this as a brilliant opportunity to be able to develop, local-based programs, not only in this space, but across all social sector areas where the community is leading the solutions. I just thought it was a good example to bring up as something that, there's a possibility there where autonomy is handed back to the community and not that reliance on, meeting KPIs of something that was developed, nationally. Just wanted to make.
Thanks, that's a good example. Thank you. Apologies for my background noise. We might be getting into argument territory in the background, but let's see how we go with my last question. I think, we've spoken a lot about the challenges, and I guess I wanted to end on, strengths and think about in the ways that, we often think of intersectionality in a way we often talk about it in a negative sense, because obviously, yes, it's about systems of oppression, but the flip side, I guess, is around diversity and the beauty of, our diverse experiences as human beings. And so I guess my question is, what can the different identities and standpoints and lived experiences of people, how can that be used as a strength to find solutions to the work on ending violence against women? Anyone want to have a go? Des?
Yeah, maybe I'll have a go, Emma. It was really funny listening to your kids in the background. My partner just left as well, and I was like, just quickly like ninja past, but it's fine. It's so disappointing that, you know, there's this amazing stuff that happens at this community level, and I'm not only talking with Aboriginal communities, I've seen other cultures as well, where this brilliant stuff happens, where people are united in their own communities and they do amazing stuff. And we often separate all this, you know, all this good stuff that's happening when we're talking about family and domestic violence and other, you know, sort of social determinants that unfortunately are harming our communities, we keep them separate. I believe that it would be great if we can somehow, you know, combine these worlds to be able to find solutions, because if you're working with men that are perpetrators of violence, you know, they've been, I guess, mandated to do a program or constantly being told how bad they are in an environment where, you know, they're under constant sort of stress. They're not going to be able to learn different ways of doing things or feel good about themselves or feel like they're, you know, coexisting in leadership with their partner and with their community. And often, you know, families want to be a part of that change as well. And, you know, combining these worlds to be able to create an environment that is positive learning, but also critical thinking for everyone, I feel will, you know, that also involves culture. And culture too, if I'm talking about Aboriginal people, as an Aboriginal person, I often struggle to culturally feel where I should be, because I know how my culture was before European, you know, contact. But in the world that I'm living in, although I still feel that I'm culturally, you know, I know and understand my culture. There's in the world that I live in, realistically, it's not played out the way that it was back in the before European contact. So being realistic about where my culture is in this world and how that works in this world, because I worry about constantly being told, oh, you know, before European contact, this is how we did things. It's good to know that, and it's good to ensure that we don't lose that. But we also need to create a dialogue and realistically understanding how our culture plays out in this world. And it doesn't mean giving into, you know, the structures and constraints of Western ways of doing things. It means knowing that when I wake up in the morning and I go to work and what my everyday life is like, and the role that my culture plays into it, will hopefully, you know, be able to build on realistic programs. I'm sorry, I went off in a bit of a tantrum there, but hopefully you understand.
No, absolutely. No, thanks, Des. I appreciate that. Calm or Fahmy? Last final thoughts?
Yeah. So, you know, and I think what I want to say follows really well from what Des just said as well. You know, decolonisation doesn't mean going back. It means going forward, but going forward with, you know, really those culturally centred values that have allowed our communities to thrive for millennia, with healthy men, healthy women, healthy kids, people who belong, who live rich and full lives and who are safe. that's where, and that's kind of a way of life that we want to recapture. And in getting there, we do need support, but we don't need saviours. We need there are people, or Aboriginal people and Indigenous people all over the world. We're not sitting back waiting for someone to come in and fix all the problems. There's very strong community agents, and both men and women doing fantastic work, and it's about understanding those change agents and the work that they've done, what's worked, what hasn't, and supporting that. But to me, the really key part of being able to meaningfully prevent violence against women and children is about having not difficult, or yes, difficult, but more than that, honest conversations. We need to be prepared to talk about abuse. We need to be prepared to talk about poverty. We need to be prepared to talk about trauma. If we're not prepared to talk about these things, and we don't have the emotional skills or capabilities to talk about these things, we are, quite frankly, the wrong people in this role. So it's, I just really think there is so much to be said, and it's one of the reasons why I love doing the work that I do. Like talking to people and not being afraid to talk to people. Really, there's an element of safety we need to keep for ourselves, yes, but we need to have frank and open discussions with men who we would, sometimes despise and generally not like. But when we do have those conversations, ask them about themselves. Ask them about what they think about themselves. Ask them about their life and their experiences. And I would hazard a guess that when you do ask them about that, you're likely to be the very first person who's ever asked them that. And I think that says a lot. And I'll finish there.
Thank you so much. Calm?
Thank you. Cannot agree more. I think those are very good summaries. For me, maybe 3 points, Emma and colleagues. I agree with Brahmin. It's just to have a deeper, more critical and more honest conversations with men and women in the community in what actually we want to achieve collectively. These are very difficult conversations, but we have to talk about, we have to confront it, about different types of injustice in our life, about the way our lives are organized. Many parts of the world, it's not working well for us. So we have to have these conversations quite frankly at the community level. Secondly, like what you said, Emma, I think we all want to live a good life, a peaceful life. So I do believe in men's and women's desire for peace and security and dignity. So I think the work can be grounded on seeing everyone as a human being with potential for goodness. Like what Desmond and Rami say, they're not just perpetrators. They can be loving father, or they're not just survivors, but they are very strong mothers. So communities want peaceful community. So we can ground our work around this positive thinking and a little bit of trust in the community that everybody wants to do something to better their own lives. And thirdly, I heard somewhere about pandemic breaking the past and help us to imagine the world anew. So maybe these conversations, ongoing conversation about new norms or ways of doing things differently, because the pandemic, like it or not, it does wake us up on many fronts. It's a new way to re-engage conversations on different issues that we are facing collectively, and that it affects our life very deeply. So it has very direct conversations, relationship with gender equality, and also violence against women. So maybe this is a chance for us to rethink about our life. How are we going from now on? Because there would be a more conversations about economic recovery that will affect all of us in the next few years, and that would play out in our life and our family. So this is a time to talk about it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kham. Thank you to all of you. This has been such an interesting, I think, an important conversation. I took so much away from it myself. I think, just in summary, a few key things that I think were reiterated throughout the discussion and that you've all pointed to is the need to have these hard and honest conversations, and for us to all, I guess, to come to that with a sense of deep listening to really understand the complex, diverse lived experiences of men as well as women's lives, and to sort of, I guess, see the humanity in us. I loved the comment that you made by me about we need support, but we don't need saviors. And I think that sort of links to this idea of reconnecting with community-led work and trying to really support that, really, even as many of you said, this micro-level work, and move away perhaps from these global notions of best practice or universal solutions, but really get grounded in the work at the micro level. And part of that, I think, was raised is also documenting that, disrupting sort of hierarchical knowledge systems and really trying to document and I guess elevate all the amazing work that actually is happening at the micro level. I thought it was also really interesting to think about, I think it was said that decolonization doesn't mean going backwards. It means understanding our past and but bringing those values into the future, into new ways of being. And I think perhaps, as you said, Kham, this moment of the pandemic offers us an opportunity to rethink the ways that we've done things and perhaps bring new ways of being into practice. I think the other thing that came out for me was that finally, I guess it's not just about, this isn't about individual coming back to men, prevention puppets and individual men engaging men and boys. This isn't just about individual work with men and boys. This is very much about systemic and structural change. And I thought there were great examples brought throughout the discussion of where we can look at that, and from economic justice to psychology to education, land management, there's environmental justice. There's so many areas that are connected to this work at a sort of structural and systemic level, and that we need to move beyond the work of engaging men and boys as an individualistic kind of endeavor to much more of, I think, a structural, community-driven approach. So I feel, extremely honoured and privileged to be able to speak with you all this morning. And thank you so much for your time and this incredible conversation. And thank you to those who have been listening and for your comments and questions. And I think that, finally, I think someone mentioned the idea of, and I think in the audience acknowledged it, that we're really all planting seeds in this work. And if we can continue to plant those seeds and continue, I guess, to nurture and that work, that hopefully we will continue to see progress in this field. And we're all committed to ending violence against women and girls. So thank you so much.